Sarah Chen pulled her warm wool sweater closer as she stepped out of her small blue house on Maple Street. The morning air was cold, and the sun was just starting to peek through the trees. She was 68 years old, but she never missed her morning walks, no matter what the weather was like. Her golden retriever, Max, woke beside her with his tail wagging happily. The streets of Foxborough were quiet at 7:30 in the morning. Most people were either still sleeping or rushing to work in their cars. Sarah liked this peaceful time of day. It reminded her of the 30 years she spent as a teacher, when she would arrive at school early to prepare her classroom before the students came. Max was a big dog with soft golden fur that seemed to shine in the morning light. He was 7 years old and had been Sarah's closest friend since her husband, Michael, passed away 3 years ago. Every morning, Max would wait by the front door with his blue leash in his mouth, ready for their walk. He knew their route by heart, past Joe's coffee shop, through the park, and back home through Oak Street. As they walked down the sidewalk, Sarah smiled at the sound of Max's paws hitting the ground and the gentle jingling of his collar tags. Fall leaves covered the ground, making soft crunching sounds under their feet. The air smelled like autumn, a mix of dry leaves and the smoke from chimneys as people started their morning fires to keep warm. They passed by Joe's coffee shop, where the smell of fresh coffee and baking bread made Sarah's stomach rumble. Through the window, she could see Joe himself, a man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes, setting up for the morning rush. He waved at her, just like he did every morning. Sarah waved back, remembering how Joe had been one of her students many years ago. Max stopped to sniff at a fire hydrant, making Sarah chuckle. Some things never changed. While she waited, she looked around at the neighborhood she had called home for 40 years. The trees were turning beautiful shades of red and orange. Mrs. Peterson's garden across the street still had some late blooming flowers. The Harrison kids had left their bikes on their front lawn again. As they turned the corner toward the park, Sarah noticed how empty the streets were. Usually, there would be at least a few other early morning walkers or joggers, but today it felt like she and Max had the whole neighborhood to themselves. The only sounds were the birds chirping in the trees and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. The park was Sarah's favorite part of their walk. It wasn't very big, but it had nice walking paths, benches where she could rest if she needed to, and a small pond where ducks often swam. Max loved the park too, especially the open grassy areas where he could run around if Sarah let him off his leash. Today, the park looked especially beautiful. The morning dew made the grass sparkle, and the rising sun created long shadows behind the trees. A light fog hung close to the ground, making everything look slightly mysterious. Sarah thought about how Michael would have loved to take pictures here. Photography had been his favorite hobby. As they walked deeper into the park, Max suddenly stopped and lifted his head. His ears perked up like they did when he heard something interesting. Sarah didn't hear anything unusual at first, but then she caught the distant sound of motorcycle engines. That was strange. Motorcycles rarely came to this quiet part of town, especially so early in the morning. Sarah checked her phone, making sure it was charged in case she needed it. It was something Michael had always told her to do. Keep your phone ready, just in case. She hadn't thought much about it before, but today, for some reason, she was glad she had it with her. Max stood close to her leg, his body tense and alert. The sound of the motorcycles was getting louder. The roar of motorcycle engines grew louder until 5 bikes suddenly appeared at the park's entrance. They were big, black motorcycles with chrome parts that sparkled in the morning sun. The riders wore black leather jackets with a red snake design on the back. Sarah had never seen them before in Foxborough. Max's body stiffened, and his friendly tail stopped wagging. He moved closer to Sarah, pressing against her leg as he watched the motorcycles. Sarah held his leash tighter and thought about turning around, but the bikers had already spotted them. The lead biker, a tall man with a thick beard, pointed in their direction. The motorcycles circled the parking lot, their engines making so much noise that the birds flew away from the trees. Sarah could feel the ground vibrate under her feet. Max started barking, not his usual happy bark, but a deep, warning sound that Sarah had only heard a few times before. "Hey, shut that mutt up," one of the bikers shouted. He was younger than the others, maybe in his 20s, with a red bandana tied around his head. The bikers revved their engines even louder, and Max barked again, trying to protect Sarah. 2 of the bikers turned their motorcycles and drove closer to where Sarah and Max stood on the walking path. They moved in circles around them, like sharks circling their prey. The noise was terrible, and the exhaust from their bikes made Sarah cough. Max's barking got louder, mixing with the sound of the engines. I said, "Shut that dog up," the young biker yelled again. He turned off his motorcycle and got off, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Another biker, a man with a shaved head and lots of tattoos on his arms, joined him. They started walking towards Sarah and Max. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she tried to stay calm. She remembered what her late husband Michael used to say, "Don't let them see you're scared." She reached for her phone in her pocket, planning to call 911, but her fingers were trembling so much that the phone slipped from her hand and fell onto the path. "What's wrong, Grandma? Can't control your stupid dog," the tattooed biker sneered. He was holding a half-empty can of soda, crushing it in his big hand. The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing across the empty park. Max growled, showing his teeth. He was a friendly dog who loved everyone, but now he sensed danger. He stood between Sarah and the bikers, his golden fur bristling along his back. Sarah had never been so grateful for his size and strength. The young biker took another step forward. "Maybe we should teach that mutt some manners," he said, reaching into his pocket. Sarah couldn't see what he was grabbing, but her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. Just then, the tattooed biker threw his soda can at Max. The can hit Max's shoulder, spraying sticky liquid over his golden fur. Max yelped in surprise but didn't move from his protective position in front of Sarah. The bikers laughed again, and the young one started to reach for something else in his pocket. Sarah looked around desperately. The park was still empty. Joe's coffee shop was too far away to call for help, and her phone lay face down on the ground. The three other bikers were still on their motorcycles, watching and laughing. She had never felt so alone and scared. "Please," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We don't want any trouble. We're just taking our morning walk." "Too late for that, Grandma," the young biker said. "Your dog needs to learn some respect." The sound of running footsteps suddenly came from the direction of the coffee shop. Sarah didn't dare turn around to look, afraid to take her eyes off the bikers. But then a strong, confident voice called out, a voice that everyone in Foxborough would recognize instantly. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone in the park froze at the sound of that familiar voice. Tom Brady stood at the edge of the walking path, still wearing his running clothes. He had been getting his morning coffee at Joe's when he heard the motorcycles and Max's barking. Even at 47 years old, he looked strong and confident as he walked toward the group. The young biker's mouth fell open. He had grown up watching Brady play for the Patriots, and now his childhood hero was standing right in front of him. The tattooed biker took a step back, suddenly looking unsure of himself. Even the three bikers still sitting on their motorcycles turned off their engines. "Tom Brady?" the young biker said in disbelief. His hand, which had been reaching for something in his pocket, dropped to his side. "What are you doing here?" Brady walked closer, his eyes taking in the scene. Sarah standing there scared, Max with soda dripping from his fur, and the five bikers who now looked much less confident than they had a minute ago. He moved to stand beside Sarah and Max, placing himself between them and the bikers. "I still visit Foxborough often," Brady said calmly. "This park is one of my favorite places to walk in the morning." He looked at the young biker more carefully. "Wait a minute. Aren't you Danny Mitchell? You played quarterback for Foxborough High a few years ago. I met you at that charity event for young athletes." The young biker's face turned red. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet Brady's eyes. "Yeah, that's me," he mumbled. The other bikers stared at their leader in surprise. They hadn't known about this connection to the football legend. "I remember you had a good arm," Brady continued. "You talked about wanting to coach kids someday. Is this what you're doing instead? Scaring elderly ladies and their dogs in the park?" Sarah watched in amazement as the tough-looking bikers seemed to shrink under Brady's disappointed gaze. Max had stopped growling and was now wagging his tail slightly, sensing the change in the situation. Brady reached down and gently patted Max's head, careful to avoid the sticky soda in his fur. We were just..." Danny struggled to find words. The tattooed biker next to him looked ashamed, staring at the crushed soda can he had thrown at Max. The three bikers on their motorcycles wouldn't look at anyone at all. "You were just what?" Brady asked. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the same authority he had used for years when leading his football teams. "Trying to prove how tough you are by threatening someone's grandmother and her dog? Is that really who you want to be?" The park fell completely quiet. Even the morning birds seemed to be listening. Sarah bent down carefully and picked up her phone from the ground. It wasn't broken, but she didn't think she would need to call 911 anymore. The way Brady handled the situation reminded her of how she used to deal with troubled students during her teaching years, with disappointment rather than anger. Danny Mitchell looked at his fellow bikers, then back at Brady. The tough guy act was gone, replaced by the face of a young man who knew he had made a big mistake. "No, sir," he said quietly. "That's not who I want to be at all." Brady nodded, then smiled slightly. "Good, because I remember that kid who wanted to make a difference in his community. He's still in there somewhere, isn't he?" Tears appeared in Danny's eyes. The tattooed biker put a hand on his shoulder, and the other bikers climbed off their motorcycles, moving closer to hear what Brady would say next. Sarah watched in amazement as the scene that had been so frightening just minutes ago turned into something completely different. The morning sun had risen higher now, making the dew on the grass sparkle like tiny diamonds. A new day was beginning in Foxborough, and for some people in that park, it would be the start of something more than just another day. Brady looked at the group of bikers standing before him. The morning light showed their faces clearly now, young men, most of them probably in their 20s, trying to act tough, but looking more lost than dangerous. He remembered being young once, trying to find his place in the world. "Let's sit down and talk," Brady said, pointing to the nearby park benches. Nobody argued. The bikers followed him like children following their teacher. Sarah watched as they all sat down, with Max still staying close to her side. The dog's tail was wagging more now, sensing that the danger had passed. Danny Mitchell sat directly across from Brady, his red bandana now hanging loose around his neck. The tattooed biker, who introduced himself as Mike, sat next to him. The other three bikers, James, Rick, and Tony, squeezed onto another bench. Their tough guy attitudes were gone, replaced by looks of respect and shame. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Danny said to Sarah, his voice soft and sincere. "And I'm sorry to your dog, too. I don't know what we were thinking." He looked down at his hands, which were shaking slightly. "It's just, life's been rough lately. Lost my job at the factory last month. Dad's sick. It feels like everything's falling apart." Brady listened carefully, the way he used to listen to teammates who were struggling. The other bikers nodded as Danny spoke. They all had similar stories. Lost jobs, family problems, feeling angry at the world. They had formed their little gang not to cause trouble, but because they needed to belong somewhere. "Life can be tough," Brady said, leaning forward on the bench. "But how we handle those tough times, that's what defines us. You guys have energy, you have strength, but you're using it the wrong way." He looked at each of them in turn. "What if you used that energy to help people instead?" Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "You know, my late husband Michael used to ride a motorcycle." The bikers looked at her in surprise. He was part of a group that did charity rides for children's hospitals. They raised thousands of dollars every year. Mike, the tattooed biker, sat up straighter. "Really? I didn't know bikers did stuff like that." He looked at the soda stain on Max's fur again and frowned. "I feel like such an idiot now. We've been acting like jerks when we could have been doing something good." Brady smiled. "It's never too late to change direction. Danny, you wanted to coach kids. That dream doesn't have to be dead. The community center needs volunteers for their youth sports program." He turned to the others. "And there's a local animal shelter that needs help walking dogs. They'd love to have strong guys like you." The morning had grown warmer, and the park was starting to fill with other people taking walks or heading to work. A few stopped and stared when they recognized Brady, but something about the serious conversation kept them from interrupting. "You really think we could do that?" James asked. He was the youngest of the group, barely 20. "You think people would trust us after how we've been acting?" Sarah surprised everyone by laughing gently. "Trust is earned," she said. "And earning it feels much better than trying to scare it out of people." Max barked once, as if agreeing with her, making everyone smile. "Tell you what," Brady said, pulling out his phone. "I know some people who can help you guys get started. But first," he looked at Max, who still had dried soda in his fur. "I think you owe this good boy a bath and a proper apology." The tough motorcycle gang that had entered the park that morning was gone. In their place sat 5 young men ready to learn a different kind of strength, the kind that comes from helping others instead of scaring them. Later that morning, at Joe's coffee shop, An unusual group sat around the largest table. Tom Brady, Sarah Chen, and Max sat with the five bikers, drinking coffee and eating breakfast sandwiches. Joe himself had brought out a bowl of water for Max and some dog treats, after helping Danny and Mike wash the soda out of the dog's fur in the shop's back sink. "So, Danny," Brady said, looking at his phone, "I just texted Coach Wilson at the community center. He remembers you from high school and says you can start helping with the youth football program next week." Danny's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger. Mike, the tattooed biker, was gently petting Max, who had completely forgiven him for the soda incident. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, "you mentioned your husband's motorcycle charity group. Do you think maybe you could tell us more about that?" Sarah took a sip of her tea before answering. "Michael kept all the old photos and papers from those days. I could bring them to the community center next week when Danny starts." She smiled at the memory. "He always said that motorcycles could bring out the best in people if used the right way." The other three bikers, James, Rick, and Tony, were looking at a map of local places that needed volunteers. Brady had made a list for them: the animal shelter, the food bank, the children's hospital, and even the town's motorcycle repair training program. Their eyes were bright with possibilities they had never considered before. Joe came over to refill their coffee cups. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about starting a weekend breakfast program for homeless folks. Could use some help with that." He looked at the bikers hopefully. "Strong guys like you could really help with setting up tables and distributing food." "We could do that," Rick said eagerly. The others nodded in agreement. Their leather jackets with the red snake design didn't look so threatening anymore, especially with Max's golden fur stuck to them from all the petting. Brady watched them all with satisfaction. He had seen many transformations in his years of football: talented players who needed guidance, troubled kids who found purpose in sports, teammates who became leaders. But this morning's change felt special. "Mrs. Chen," Tony asked suddenly, "would you and Max like an escort on your morning walks? We could take turns. Make sure you're safe. Not that you need protection anymore." Max proved he's brave enough for 10 dogs. Max wagged his tail at the compliment. Sarah thought about it. Just an hour ago, these same young men had terrified her. But now, looking at their sincere faces and seeing how gentle they were with Max, she made her decision. "That would be lovely," she said. "And please, call me Sarah." Brady checked his watch. "I got to head out soon," he said. "But first, let's exchange numbers. I want to hear how everything goes." He looked at Danny, "especially about the coaching. Those kids are going to be lucky to have you." The morning sun streamed through Joe's coffee shop windows, making the chrome on the parked motorcycles outside sparkle. The bikes didn't look threatening anymore either. Just machines that could be used for good or bad, depending on their riders' choices. Joe brought out a box of fresh donuts. "On the house," he said with a smile, "to celebrate new beginnings." As they shared the donuts, they started making plans. The animal shelter visits would start tomorrow. The community center program began next week, and on Sunday, they would help Joe with his first breakfast program. Sarah watched it all, amazed at how her frightening morning had turned into something so hopeful. Max lay at her feet, content and sleepy after all the excitement and attention. Sometimes she thought the worst moments could lead to the best changes. The community center gym echoed with the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter. Danny Mitchell stood in the middle of the court, wearing a clean white t-shirt with "Coach" printed on the back. Around him, 12 kids aged 8 to 10 practiced their passing drills, their faces serious with concentration. "That's it, Jenny. Great form." Danny called out to a small girl with braids who had just made a perfect chest pass. A week ago, he'd been a scary biker in a leather jacket. Now he was Coach Danny, and these kids looked at him like he was their hero. In another part of town, Mike and James were at the Foxborough Animal Shelter. They had traded their motorcycle boots for comfortable sneakers as they walked dogs through the neighborhood. Mike was handling 3 dogs at once. He had discovered he had a special way with the bigger, more difficult dogs that other volunteers were afraid to walk. "Look at Rex," James said, pointing to the large German shepherd that Mike was walking. "A week ago, nobody could even get near him. Now he follows you like a puppy." Mike smiled, remembering how Max had forgiven him so easily for the soda incident. Dogs, he was learning, were better than people at giving second chances. At Joe's coffee shop, Rick and Tony had become regular volunteers for the new weekend breakfast program. They used their motorcycles to pick up donated food from local stores and restaurants. The homeless people who came for breakfast weren't scared of their leather jackets anymore. Instead, they greeted them with smiles and thanks. Sarah Chen sat at her usual table in Joe's shop, drinking tea and watching the activity. Max lay under the table, wearing a new blue bandana that the bikers had given him as a peace offering. Every morning that week, one of the bikers had shown up to walk with them through the park. Today had been James's turn, and he had told her all about his new job interview at the motorcycle repair shop. Brady had kept his promise to stay in touch. His morning visit to Foxborough had turned into regular check-ins with the group. He didn't just ask about their volunteer work. He wanted to know about Danny's dad's health, about Mike's job search, about all the little things that showed they were changing their lives. The bell above Joe's door jingled as Danny walked in after his coaching session. His face was tired but happy. Some of the breakfast program volunteers waved to him, and he waved back before joining Sarah at her table. "The kids are amazing," he told her, accepting a cup of coffee from Joe. "There's this one boy, Tommy. Reminds me of myself at that age. All energy, no direction. But today he helped one of the younger kids learn a new drill. Made me proud." Sarah smiled, thinking about her years of teaching. "That's how it starts," she said. "One small moment of doing the right thing leads to another and another." Max thumped his tail in agreement, making them both laugh. Through the shop window, they could see Mike and James walking past with their group of shelter dogs. The afternoon sun made their new volunteer t-shirts bright against their old leather jackets. Rex, the once aggressive German shepherd, was walking calmly beside Mike, occasionally looking up at him with trusting eyes. "Hard to believe it's only been a week," Danny said quietly. He watched his friends pass by, remembering how different things had been 7 days ago. "We were so lost, trying to feel powerful by scaring people. But this?" He gestured around at everything. The kids at the community center, the breakfast program, the dog walking. "This is real power." Sarah patted his hand. "Michael used to say that everyone has good in them. Sometimes they just need help finding it." She looked at Max, who had been the start of all this change. Even scary moments can lead to beautiful things. Outside, the sound of happy dogs and talking people mixed with the normal afternoon noise of Foxborough. Inside, a former teacher and a former troublemaker sat sharing coffee, proving that second chances could change not just one life, but an entire community. The Foxborough Community Center was packed with people on a crisp Saturday morning. Tom Brady stood at a small podium, looking out at the crowd gathered for the first Bikes for Kids charity event. In just 1 month, Danny and his friends had turned their love for motorcycles into something amazing. Rows of shiny motorcycles lined the community center parking lot. Each one had a small sign telling its story, how the bikers had fixed it up to sell, with all the money going to buy sports equipment for kids who couldn't afford it. Danny's group had worked every evening after their volunteer work to repair the old bikes. A month ago, Brady said into the microphone, "I met some young men who reminded me that it's never too late to change your path." He looked at Danny, who stood with his fellow bikers near the front. They weren't wearing their old leather jackets anymore. Instead, they had on new blue jackets with Foxborough Community Riders written on the back. Sarah Chen sat in the front row with Max beside her. The golden retriever was wearing a special vest that said, "Therapy Dog in Training." After seeing how good Max was with scared kids at the community center, Mike had suggested getting him certified as a therapy dog. Now Max visited the children's hospital every weekend with Mike and the other bikers. "These guys didn't just change their own lives," Brady continued. "They're changing our whole community. The youth sports program has doubled in size. The animal shelter has more volunteers than ever before. And today, they're showing us how to turn what some people might see as troublemaking machines into tools for helping others." In the crowd, Joe from the coffee shop smiled proudly. His weekend breakfast program had grown too big for the coffee shop. It now operated from the community center kitchen, with the bikers and other volunteers serving over 100 people every Sunday. Rick and Tony had even started teaching some of the homeless guests basic motorcycle repair skills, helping them find jobs. Danny's father sat in his wheelchair near the front, looking much better than he had a month ago. The stress of medical bills had been what started Danny down the wrong path, but now the community was helping. Local doctors, inspired by the bikers' change, had started a program to help patients who couldn't afford treatment. But the real hero of this story, Brady said, isn't me, or even these wonderful young men. He gestured to Max, who wagged his tail at the attention. It's a brave dog who protected his owner, and then showed us all how to forgive and move forward. Max barked once, making everyone laugh. James stepped up to the microphone next. He had gotten the job at the motorcycle repair shop and was now teaching evening classes. We thought we were tough guys, he said, his voice shaking a little. But real toughness isn't about scaring people. It's about helping them, even when things are hard. The crowd clapped as Danny unveiled their latest project, a special motorcycle with a sidecar, painted bright blue. This is for the kids at the children's hospital, he explained. We're going to take them for rides in the sidecar, safely of course, to help them feel free and happy even when they're sick. Sarah watched it all with tears in her eyes. She thought about that scary morning in the park, how close she had come to calling the police. But instead, thanks to Brady's intervention and everyone's willingness to change, something beautiful had grown from that moment of fear. Max put his head on her lap, and she scratched behind his ears. Around them, the community center buzzed with excitement as people examined the motorcycles, signed up for volunteer programs, and talked about future projects. The 5 bikers who had once tried to scare her were now at the center of it all, showing everyone that the best kind of strength comes from helping others. You were right, Michael, Sarah whispered, thinking of her late husband. There really is good in everyone. Max wagged his tail as if agreeing, while above them, the autumn sun shone down on a community that had learned the true meaning of power and respect. Sarah Chen sat on her favorite bench in the park, enjoying the warm spring sunshine. Max lay at her feet, his golden fur now showing touches of gray, but his tail still wagging happily. The park had changed a lot in the past year. New playground equipment bought with money from the bikers' charity events, fresh flowers planted by community volunteers, and a small memorial garden dedicated to those who had helped transform Foxborough. Morning, Sarah. Morning, Max. Danny Mitchell called out as he jogged over. He wasn't wearing a leather jacket anymore. Today he had on a neat polo shirt with Foxborough Youth Sports Director embroidered on it. The community center had hired him full-time 3 months ago to run their expanded programs. Ready for the big parade tomorrow? Sarah asked, smiling as Max got up to greet Danny. The town was having its first Community Heroes Day, and the Foxborough Community Riders were going to lead the parade on their motorcycles. Almost ready, Danny said, sitting down next to her. Mike's still working on the special sidecar formation. We want it to be perfect when we take the kids from the hospital for their ride. In the past year, their motorcycle therapy program had become famous across the state. Other towns were starting to copy it. Tom Brady had visited last week to film a documentary about the change in Foxborough. He interviewed everyone, the bikers, the kids from the sports programs, the people from Joe's breakfast program who now had jobs and homes, and even Max, who barked right on cue for the camera. Remember that morning? Danny asked quietly, watching other people walk through the park. Mothers with strollers, joggers, dog walkers, nobody was afraid anymore. I was so lost, so angry. Who would have thought that scaring a sweet old lady and her dog would end up changing everything? Sarah laughed. First, I'm not that old. And second, you didn't scare us that much. Max was ready to take on all 5 of you. They both watched as Max, now a certified therapy dog with hundreds of hospital visits under his collar, gently played with a butterfly that had landed near his paw. The sound of motorcycles approached, but nobody in the park flinched. Mike, James, Rick, and Tony pulled up nearby, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun. They'd all wore the blue Foxborough Community Riders jackets, each one showing patches for different volunteer achievements. The hospital called, Mike announced as they walked over. Remember Rex, that aggressive German shepherd from the shelter? He just passed his therapy dog test. He's going to start visiting patients with Max next week. The former guard dog had become another symbol of how things could change with patience and kindness. Joe came from his coffee shop, carrying a tray of drinks for everyone. His weekend breakfast program had grown into a full community kitchen that helped feed hundreds of people. Just heard from the mayor, he said, passing out the cups. They're going to make Community Heroes Day an annual event. And guess who they want to organize it? The bikers looked embarrassed but proud. Their small group had grown into a large volunteer organization, with people from all over town wearing the blue jackets and helping others. Danny's father, now fully recovered, ran their office, and coordinated all the charity rides. Tom Brady may have been the hero that morning, Sarah said, looking at the group around her, but all of you are the real heroes of this story. You proved that people can change, that mistakes can lead to miracles, and that the scariest moments might just be the beginning of something wonderful. Max barked in agreement, making them all laugh. Above them, the spring sun shone down on a town that had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the best heroes aren't the ones who show up to save the day, but the ones who choose to change it, one small act of kindness at a time. And it had all started with 5 angry bikers, 1 brave dog, and a football legend who believed in second chances.